Hello, I'm Ann Meisinger, Assistant Educator, Public Programs, and Creative Practice at the Met. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the third and final day of our virtual convening, People, a Global Dialogue on Museums and Their Publics. I'm privileged to be speaking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Canarsie people and respectfully acknowledge the Met's location in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape diaspora. Today, we'll explore community partnerships in our final session of the convening, and then we'll be joined by Sarah Lewis, Associate Professor, History of Art and Architecture, and African American Studies at Harvard University for our keynote presentation. We'll sum it all up with closing remarks from Heidi Holder, the Frederick P. and Sandra P. Rose Chair of Education. We're looking forward to spending the next few hours with you, and we hope that you'll use the chat during the presentations and during our panel discussion. Our aim for these presentations is that they are catalysts for discussion, and that you'll join us in that conversation by participating in the chat with questions and comments. We're also offering closed captions. You can turn closed captioning on or off by using the CC icon toward the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. Our program will be recorded and made available for you to view at a later date. To tell you more about the session on community partnerships and to introduce our speakers for the fifth session, it is my honor to turn it over to Sydney Munn, a member of our teen internship program here at the Met. Welcome, Sydney.
Hello. I'm Sydney Munn, and I'm a teen intern with the Met. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the session Community Partnerships as a part of our program, People, a global dialogue on museums and their publics. Communities, like the ones I belong to, are significant partners in the work that museums do. For example, I am a part of Gen Z, I am African American, and I am a musician. Those are important communities for me. Communities also have relationships with institutions, and there are a number of questions about the relationship between communities and institutions that our speakers will respond to today. From the perspective of communities, what are the methods and challenges of museum community partnerships? And how can museums serve as public resources that center the needs of communities rather than the needs of institutions? I'm looking forward to hearing from today's speakers, who I'm sure will add to this list of questions and to our understanding of the museum-community relationship. Louise Hunter is an Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous, and South Sea Islander woman from Cairns in far north Queensland, Australia. Her Aboriginal connections are through her grandmothers. Her paternal grandmother is a Girame woman from Cardwell, and her maternal grandmother is a Kukunyongo woman, stolen from near Wujal Wujal and taken to Yarrabah. Her South Sea Islander heritage comes from her maternal grandfather, whose ancestors originate from Ambrym Island, Vanuatu. She is the lead of Indigenous Services at the State Library of Queensland, and she manages a team of staff who support Indigenous councils across Queensland to operate a library service called Indigenous Knowledge Centres. Dr. Samir Migueli is the Senior Curator at the Smithsonian Institution's Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. His research and curatorial work have focused on social movements, urban studies, and African American history and culture. He received his BA from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from Columbia University. Joshua Bell is a cultural anthropologist and the curator of globalization at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. Combining ethnographic fieldwork with research in museums and archives, Bell examines the shifting local and global network of relationships between persons, artifacts, and the environment. He is a founding member of the Recovering Voices program, which connects communities to Smithsonian collections in the effort to support knowledge and language documentation, sustainability, and revitalization. The project management team of Multaka, Salma Awad, and Sarah Fortman Hijazi will be presenting jointly. Salma was born in Damascus and lives in Berlin, Germany. She has a BA in law from Damascus University and an MA in intercultural conflict management at the ASH Berlin. She is a Multaka project manager at the Museums of Islamic Art and guide in the German Historical Museum, focusing on migration-related issues and outreach to Middle Eastern communities. Sarah holds a doctorate in intercultural literature. She is a Berlin-based project manager who has worked for several cultural programs. She is enthused by the question as to how museums can serve as a public space for diverse communities to reclaim agency, to undermine institutionalized structures and thinking patterns. Today's discussion will be moderated by Kemi Eleisimi. Kemi is the executive director of the Laundromat Project, an organization that advances artists and neighbors as change agents in their own communities. She previously worked at Creative Capital Foundation and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Kemi is a graduate of Smith College, New York University, and Coral Leadership NY. She also serves on several boards and advisory committees. A warm welcome to all our session participants.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Sydney. And thank you to the whole team at the Met for really all the work you've done to organize and convene this important symposium. I'm really glad to be able to be a part of it. What I'd like to share today is a bit about our museums. That's the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum's history, how that's shaped our community-based museum practice, and share a bit about a recent exhibition project that I think embodies this ethos, and which was the culmination of a kind of a deep, meaningful community building process. And I think if I can encapsulate what is at the heart of this kind of a practice, it's a commitment to the idea and the ideal of a kind of democratization of knowledge, which is not just broadening or increasing access to some body of knowledge, but actually working collaboratively with communities to co-construct knowledge, whether it be about our past or our present, and also fundamentally a rethinking of this idea of who's deemed a knowledge creator, and of institutionalizing a kind of community collaborative approach to knowledge making. In a way that decenters, in some senses, the traditional museum as the arbiter of what's quote unquote important history, or from what perspectives that history is told. And so in other words, I think our value as an institution is derived from the extent to which our communities see us as being a partner in work that's meaningful and valuable and worthwhile. So with that, I'll dive a bit into the history of our particular museum, which I think has a pretty unique and distinctive history, both within the context of the Smithsonian Institution at large and the museum world even more broadly. In the midst of the 1960s, the then head of the Smithsonian, Dylan Ripley, was grappling with, as so many heads of institutions were of all kinds in that period, in the midst of the civil rights and emerging Black Power movements, the anti-war movements, et cetera, of really how to remake institutions and reimagine institutions in ways that more meaningfully captured the richness and the diversity of the country and perspectives. And the reality was that in Washington, D.C., which at this time in the 1960s had just shortly before become the first major US city to have a majority African-American population, the Smithsonian museums on the National Mall saw very few local African-American visitors. And so he had this idea of opening up a Smithsonian museum off of the National Mall in a DC neighborhood, and kind of opened up a call to DC neighborhoods. And this particular neighborhood in Southeast DC called Anacostia had a particularly active and engaged group of civic leaders and residents who took up the call and took up the challenge and worked with the Smithsonian to become the site for this new museum. And this is actually the site that you're seeing here, which was an old theater called the Carver Theater that was selected because it was right in the heart of the community on the main thoroughfare, which at the time was called Nichols Avenue. Today it's Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. The other thing that happened in the creation of our museum, and was maybe the most important move that the Smithsonian made, was hiring John Kennard is our founding director. John Kennard had actually zero museum experience, but an incredible background as a community organizer, as a pastor, and had great standing in the community, and in particular, a knowledge of what it meant to organize and work with communities around issues that were important to them. And so he took this notion of a Smithsonian museum, in some ways, which was a paternalistic notion that the Smithsonian would bring its treasures and its riches and somehow enrich an impoverished neighborhood. John Kennard and the founding staff took that idea and really flipped it on its head and said, no, in fact, there's rich history and culture right here in this neighborhood. Yes, we'll feature prized artifacts from collections across the Smithsonian, but what we want to do is build from the ground up a museum that can, in a way that the Smithsonian had at that time not yet done, to really meaningfully document, preserve, and share and celebrate the history and culture of local communities and of communities of color. And so he went about building this institution from the ground up in collaboration with the community. Created a community advisory board from the very beginning, before the museum even opened its doors, that could weigh in on everything from how the museum what it should look like, but also what kinds of exhibitions and programming it should undertake. This is, again, just in the midst of its construction. He engaged young people. There was a youth group called the Trailblazers who assisted with preparations for the opening and also, again, helped weigh in about programming and exhibitions. There was a youth advisory council that also served a similar purpose and also served as a way to train young people from the neighborhood in museum practice. Ultimately, there was also a mobile museum as a way to bring content and activities and events off of the museum property itself across the neighborhood and the city. One early exhibition that really is of note, in part because it was both controversial, but I think also set the tone for the approach to the museum's work, was this exhibition called The Rat Man's Invited Affliction, which grew out of the fact that the museum had a small petting zoo when it opened, and neighborhood kids were particularly afraid of and angry at the fact that there were these rodents in the museum, which they mistook for rats. And a conversation developed about the fact that these, in fact, were not rats, but that, the young people in the neighborhood and residents of all ages, for that matter, were concerned about the fact that there was disproportionate rat infestations in the neighborhood. And so the museum, early educator Zora Felton Martin and our director John Kennard took up the idea of actually creating an exhibition about this urgent social issue in the neighborhood, rat infestations, but using this mundane and seemingly taboo subject to actually use it as a window onto broader issues of urban ecology and social inequality, and work with young people to develop the content of the exhibition. So this are just some photos from the exhibition itself, which opened in 1969 and stirred a great deal of controversy within the museum world. One, that a museum would broach an issue such as rat infestations and urban ecology and social inequality, and two, that it was a Smithsonian museum, no less. But I think this notion of really broaching contemporary social issues, urgent social issues, shaped by the interests and desires of neighborhood residents, was an approach and is an approach that's so fundamental to how we do our work as a museum, even for an exhibition that occurred this early on in the museum's history, has remained with us in terms of the ethos and approach. This is the museum today, which is still in the Anacostia neighborhood, obviously, just a few blocks from where the original site first stood. And what I will talk about now, just for my remaining minutes, is about a recent exhibition project which marked our 50th anniversary at the museum, and it was called A Right to the City. And what it did was, in the midst of a rapidly gentrifying city, in fact, DC was one of the most rapidly gentrifying cities in the country and has been for a number of years, took an opportunity to actually contextualize and historicize the change that was happening, working with community members across the city to document and preserve the history of the neighborhoods from the perspective of people who've lived in and made the city's history, really. And so over the course of several years, we went about developing this exhibition in collaboration with communities and trying to document histories that really, some may be surprised to know that DC's history relative to so many other major US cities has gone quite underdocumented and understudied. And so we went about trying to better document the city's history from the perspective of residents by doing nearly 200 oral histories with a wide range of individuals. We hosted community forums on a range of aspects of gentrification and neighborhood change, so about neighborhood change in the arts. And we would bring community members, various kinds of local experts to the table to have these conversations, to surface perspectives about these issues, with the intention that those perspectives would then shape what ends up on the walls in the exhibition. About gentrification and public education. Then we had neighborhood-specific community forums like this one about the past and future of DC's Chinatown. And this is the exhibition itself, which again, over the course of a couple of years, really was deeply shaped by our community partners from across the city, people of all ages, everything from organizers and activists to government officials, to architects, and urban planners, to just longtime residents in the city. We also created, with a repurposed payphone in the exhibition, a storytelling system where people could pick up the phone, listen to clips from oral history interviews, and actually also record a story of their own. So it was a hotline that lived in this payphone, but also on a hotline that people could call the phone number of. And we had phone cards that people could pick up and share with others, and have folks record their stories. The idea was really to extend the conversation that we hope began in the exhibition, thoughts that were provoked, memories that were provoked. People could share their thoughts and memories on this storytelling hotline and contribute to the conversation themselves. We also partnered with the DC Public Library, which has locations across the city, to install satellite exhibits that had neighborhood-specific content in the neighborhood libraries. So for instance, the Adams Morgan content, which is a neighborhood in DC, was in that neighborhood's public library. And we also installed phones where people could, again, connect to that storytelling hotline and leave their neighborhood-specific stories. And in the case of Adams Morgan, is a neighborhood with a large Latinx population. And so we had actually two phones, one in Spanish and one in English. We brought the phone to events around the city, when we had community events off-site, including street festivals like this one, the Adams Morgan Day, which is the longest running street festival in DC. And we also collaborated with the Humanities Truck, which is a project out of American University, where we created a kind of pop-up exhibit inside of the truck that people could walk up inside and see, but there was also content on the outside of the truck, including a large screen on which we were able to play clips from oral histories. So again, the idea is to in collaborating with communities and documenting the history, actually ensuring that the history is shared with those same communities, right? Not just on site at the museum, but in places where people are living and working and playing in their own neighborhoods. We also created a texting system for the Adams Morgan Day event and neighborhood, where people could text this phone number and actually get back historic photos of particular locations in the neighborhood. Again, it's another way to bring the history to life. These are sites that we interviewed people about. We were able to uncover historic photographs of it and built this system, again, to be another participatory way for that kind of community building and history documentation. So just in closing, I think part of what the exhibition we hoped did, and I think in some ways showed itself to do, was become a kind of an organizing point for all kinds of individuals and organizations and collectives from across the city who used it as a way to further conversations in the city about what could be done in the face of rapid gentrification, drawing on lessons from a rich and complicated history in the city as the nation's capital that had been governed for a century or more without any local self-government or representation. And so we had organizing collectives come and lead day-long sessions, training sessions with their staff and community members. We had elected officials come and bring their staffs and have conversations with them about the content, brainstorming ideas, policy suggestions. So it really became a way, even though we had worked with the community in documenting this history, it became a way to actually give back and contribute to the conversations that were happening in the city about what to do in the face of a rapidly changing, rapidly gentrifying city. So I'll end there, looking forward to the conversation, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Samir. You set things up for me nicely, and thank you for the warm introduction. It's really fantastic to be here today. My name's Joshua Bell. I want to begin, before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging the Piscataway, who are and other traditional custodians of the Potomac region, on which Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian, and indeed my own home, rest. And I do so to acknowledge their custodianship, which I think is too often overlooked, and as part of my acknowledgement of the work that I, as a curator, my museum, the National Museum of Natural History, and I would argue the wider Smithsonian, needs to do to better acknowledge and engage with these histories. So today I'm going to talk to you about Recovering Voices, which is an initiative that colleagues and I created in 2009 at the Smithsonian to really help address the global but also local crisis that we're looking at in terms of linguistic and cultural knowledge silence. And in doing so, Recovering Voices was really created to help kind of meet the obligations that we as curators and staff, and I would argue the National Museum of Natural History and the wider Smithsonian, have to the diverse communities of origin that our collections come from. So my title today, or subtitle, Dancing with Archives and Objects, comes from a quote from Rosanna Raymond, who's a Pacifica artist and scholar, and who remarked, quote, "If you let objects dance, they will." And I love this comment by Rosanna because she captures very pointedly this dynamic of how objects, more often than not, want to be active and they want to be connected to people. And I would argue that letting object dance, in her phrase, or creating opportunities for them to dance with communities for various different reasons, is kind of at the core of what Recovering Voices seeks to do. And my hope today is that in outlining what we are doing at Recovering Voices and what we've done, is I'm going to add to the discussion about the potentiality of what museums can and should be doing, particularly in terms of how to address longstanding legacies of colonialism and disenfranchisement that the Smithsonian has knowingly and unknowingly been a part of. So I am at the National Museum of Natural History, which is one of the constellation of museums alongside the Anacostia Museum, which you just heard about, that is part of the Smithsonian. We have at the museum some 146 million objects, which they span the history of the institution, that is the Smithsonian, and are a portal through which to understand not only the universe, the Earth, but also humanity's history, its present and possible future. Now, the impetus for Recovering Voices emerged out of a pressing global and local challenge faced by the erosion of language and cultural knowledge. And that is a challenge that I would argue that's on par with the destruction of biodiversity. I don't want to equate the two, but the public is very aware, I think, of environmental degradation. But I'm not so sure that they're as aware of what's happening in terms of the silencing of diversity around the world. It is estimated that by the end of the century, half of the 7,000 languages spoken will be silenced. And so the question is, what implication does this have for the communities that are speakers of these languages and knowledge bearers, and then for wider humanity? And so Recovering Voices seeks to address this issue because this diversity, I would argue, matters not only locally and globally, because language and cultural knowledge are archives through which we can understand what it means to be human. Right? They are the kind of way in which our heritage is transmitted and identity and a whole bundle of things. So then, if that is the case, then collections in their various forms are important repositories or perhaps flashpoints for this knowledge. And here I'm thinking not only of cultural objects, which I'm going to be focusing on, but also some of the biological collections. I've had the privilege of working in Papua New Guinea for the last 21 years. And there, they really don't make the same distinction between nature and culture that we do. It's really all culture. And that is true for not all, but many indigenous societies. And I think that framing kind of challenges what we often think of what an object is, what a person is. And it's the sort of, I think, work that we need to do as curators to kind of be open to that. So with that in mind, then Recovering Voices emerged in 2009 as part of an internal process at the National Museum of Natural History. And it became and is a collaboration between our museum, the National Museum of American Indian, the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, as well as now the Smithsonian Asia Pacific American Center. And I should say we build very much on a long-standing tradition within this museum of engaging communities, right? So this did not just come out of nowhere. And our goal is to really kind of seek through interdisciplinary research of connecting communities to collections, particularly their own collections, to really help with knowledge documentation and revitalization. And this is something that, as you can imagine, this is not something that we as researchers are dictating, but rather opening up the door to allow community engagement and facilitating access and working against very valid perceptions and misperceptions that the museum is not there as a resource for communities. So it's about opening up the museum in many ways. And we do that in various forms. And I'm going to briefly talk about public outreach. That has been a critical aspect of what we do. And it takes many forms. One major effort that's currently ongoing through to the end of this month is the Mother Tongue Film Festival. And through this festival, we provide a platform for digital storytelling. And we seek to really, through using the Smithsonian's name and kind of recognition, create a platform to kind of amplify the work of diverse practitioners who explore through their filmmaking the power of language. We're now in our 6th year of doing this. And we're working to use, again, the Smithsonian to really kind of open people's minds about what language and cultural diversity is and really help promote the public awareness of the diversity that is our world. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to come back to this and continue to focus on this. The core of our work, though, is kind of our collections. And so core to that is a methodology that developed with our colleagues. And there's a program that we run called the Community Research Program. It's led by my colleague, Gwen Isaac, who is currently director of Recovering Voices. This is the directorship of the program is one that we designed purposely to rotate as a kind of a chance to be a little more democratic and to kind of eschew some of the empire building that happens often in museums. But what the Community Research Program does, and I'm showing you 2 images of visits, is we facilitate community visits. And so what we do every year is put out calls. There's an application process. And we're looking for communities who are interested in working with our collections towards some language, culture, documentation, revitalization aim. It's a very wide remit, but we're really seeking through this work to open up the collections. We kind of have a preference to kind of help develop intergenerational knowledge building as part of these projects. And then as part of that, then wider dissemination within the community. So groups come, and we've worked with 30 around 30 to date. And they come and they work anywhere from a week to a month within our collections. We do a lot of work prior to visits, ascertaining what it is in our collections that's there. We also work with them to document their visit, being very sensitive to different knowledges and what can and can't be documented. This documentation really through film is done for the community, so that group will have an opportunity to share. We also digitize material. So it's really, again, part of turning the museum inside out, and I'm happy to answer more questions. So in what time I have left, I want to focus on one particular example that I've been involved with for several years, because I want to give a sense, I think it gives a sense of the sort of repair work that can happen through these visits, and what happens when, I think, museums learn to open themselves up to communities, as scary as that might be, and to kind of let go of things, and what happens, and how important that dance can be. So my story really begins with repatriation, the international repatriation of 54 Indigenous ancestral remains, originally collected in Aotearoa, New Zealand, by the National Museum of Natural History, or staff that then the materials came into the museum. And this was our first official international repatriation in 2016. And this, I had the honor of being involved. As you can imagine, this was a very somber event, but a very important one. And it set the ground for relationship building. And this is, I think, one of these critical things that we'll come back to in our discussions, is opening up the collections is really about building relationships. This led to the bringing of a temporary traveling exhibit to the National Museum of Natural History in 2017, Tuku Ihu, which was brought by the New Zealand Maori Arts and Crafts Institute, which really transformed my museum for 10 days into the site for Maori performances and the making of things. And I think for me, it still remains one of the highlights of my careers, because having transforming our museum, it really broke down hierarchies within the museum. And I'm happy to explain that in the Q&A, but also engage the public in just a different way, which was really useful. As part of that, visiting artists, Heme Araru and James Ricard and others actually built a canoe, or finally kind of put together the final assembly of a canoe. And that became another focal point as part of this display. And as part of that, the visitors were welcomed and engaged. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of just engage and be with these practitioner artists. We, as part of this, went to MSC, where we store a lot of our oversized and most of our anthropological collections. And as part of that, we encountered this canoe, which I had known about, but it was a canoe that was gifted to us by Queen Kapiolani, who was the penultimate queen of the Kingdom of Hawaii. She gifted this canoe in 1887. And Jaime, or James, looked at this and immediately jumped onto his smartphone and started texting with his friend, Aliko Bumata, who is a Hawaiian master canoe builder, and said, hey, you need to see this and know about this. And it was in that moment that this, the Va'a project, or canoe project, that was born, that I've had the pleasure of working with Jaime, Alika's father, Ray Bumata, who sadly passed, and then my colleague at the Smithsonian, Kaleva Korea, who's curator of Hawaii and Pacific American at APAC. And this project, and here's a picture of this canoe after it came to the museum in 1889. This has evolved various things, and I think core to what we've tried to do, and obviously with something that's a gift, there's a kind of different valence and kind of value placed to it. But what we have sought to do is to kind of make this canoe continue to travel, so that the next generation of carvers and the wider Pacifica community can come to understand it. So that involved in 2018 scanning the canoe, and we're in the process of actually making that scan go live for people to view as augmented reality through their either website or their phone. And we did that with folks from the University of Southern Florida's Library Digital Heritage and Humanities. It also involved bringing Ray, his son Alika, Jaime's students together to engage the canoe and actually put it back together again. It was taken apart and actually conserved in 2004 by my colleague Adrian Kepler for an exhibit. So we were the first group in about 15 years to really actively engage it and to kind of understand. And it is the oldest known canoe in a museum collection. It's about 238 years old. And so part of it was really to really understand what this canoe was about and use it as a teaching tool. So this is what it looks like together. That involved a series of steps over the next several years. One was engaging with female canoe builders in Hilo, Hawaii, led by my colleague Kaleva Korea. And then my joining a Rata or Canoe Symposium in Aotearoa, New Zealand later that year to actually work with Derek Kowaiti, who's pictured here, to put together a full-scale digital print inspired by the canoe. This then took the last phase, if you will, is kind of emerged through a program started again by Gwen Isaac called Recovering Voices at Home. So in the wake of COVID, if you can't physically come into the museum, how do you connect communities to collections? So this has been a series of digital efforts. So here is Alika and his wife working on finishing some of the canoes begun a year earlier. And so I just want to thank everyone. I'm happy to talk more about this, but I would just urge everyone that, opening up museums, collections, and letting them dance is a critical aspect of our work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, many thanks to the whole team and to the introduction, and thank you all for being here. My colleagues Salma and I are going to present the Multaka project today. And I'm going to start to question how do we reach out to unaddressed communities and how do we engage communities? Well, the Museum for Islamic Arts, where we work, offers various educational projects, and the projects improve the cultural participation of diverse groups and opens up the museum to the more than ever diverse society, I would say. There's a project called Tamam, and it is an educational project, and it improves cultural participation of Muslims, and it works with mosques or mosque communities and experts together in order to strengthen the social cohesion. And we have two other projects, Cultural Tales from the Museum of Islamic Art and the one called Shared Past, Shared Future. These projects are outreach initiatives that work, for instance, with children, with schools and youth centers together in order to intensify the intercultural dialogues. Because intercultural education is an important part of the process of developing social competencies and fostering integration. But we want to focus on our project Multaka, where we work for, and Multaka is Arabic and it means meeting point. And what was the starting point? Well, in December 2015, the Museum of Islamic Art, in cooperation with 3 other museums, started this project and trained newcomers from Syria and Iraq to be museum guides. And their role was developing and leading interactive tours for newcomers from the same region and in their mother tongue. Around 2 years later, in summer 2018, we have included German and English tours as well in our fixed program. And it's quite important to mention that, or to note, that we deleted the subheading refugees as guides in Berlin museums, because we think that the wording is not any more appropriate. And since, among other things, the guides have been living here for many years now and have become locals. before the project has conducted tours, the guides were toured, and then they were asked and given the freedom to choose their own museum, and they were also asked to choose their own objects they want to explain or they want to cover in their guided tours. So they choose the museum and the objects, and were given a training in the museum that they have chosen in order to make the tour as interactive as possible. So these are two things I want to stress because they're very important, and I think also innovative. They have the liberty of choice and the offer of a space for multiple stories. This is striking, I think, for this project. Why? Because it offers the opportunity to reinterpret collections through their own stories. And of course, it underlines that there's not one and only explanation and emphasizes the importance of many stories. Mm-hmm. So this is and of course, the interactive approach simultaneously invites people to ask themselves what they feel when they go through the museum and see the exhibits. For example, when they they see Syrian or Iraqi artifacts which are displayed in the museum. So it's a kind of confrontation as well. So the approach behind it is to break with the idea of a museum which claims to have the truth, and to break with institutionalized, dominant or hierarchical narratives. So the museum works like a space or for intercultural exchange. And with dialogue and discussion, guides help visitors, of course, to explore the museum and the exhibits while providing their personal perspectives and achieving relevance. And since we work interactively, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Salma now.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations first and for the invite as well. As Sarah mentioned, we started giving in 2015 tours in these 4 museums. The museums are the Museum of Islamic Art and the Ancient Near East Museum at the Pergamon Museum, the German Historical Museum, and the Bode Museum, which is basically the Museum of Byzantine Art and the Sculpture. So the idea behind the project, as Sarah said, was to, first of all, to diversify the museum structure as such. And of course, since we're talking about community and engaging the community, the idea was also to change the perspective for the German public as well as for the newcomer communities. I'm going to say quote unquote, I'm just going to, I don't know if you can see my hands as well, because as Sarah also mentioned, language is very important. Newcomer, terms such as newcomers or integration are highly problematic at this time. So we are trying also to change that as well, because we as a community, the people who have reached Germany or have arrived to Germany after 2014, especially from Syria and Iraq, would like to, let's say, introduce ourselves the way that we would like to be seen. So I also think that Joshua has also mentioned this, it's about the language as well. So why is it about the language? It has 2 very important issues. First of all, the language is the way to speak to people. And we thought that in order to bring the community into the museum, to reach out for this community, we should speak the language of the community. So there are 2 aspects of it. First of all, the Arabic language, it's our mother tongue. So in order to encourage people whose mother tongue is Arabic to come into the museum, we thought, of course, we have to provide an offer that speaks to them and that makes them feel addressed. So the idea was to hold these tours in Arabic, as I've mentioned before. The objects within these 4 museums, however, serve this, let's say, concept or the goal of the museum to create this intercultural dialogue, to create a better knowledge of how migration works, let's say, how good migration is, to highlight these objects, to show that nothing basically is born out of nothing. Everything is about migration, it's about movement. So the communities would feel actually acknowledged and appreciated. I will then go into the specifications of each museum. This we can actually skip that slide. So the Museum of Islamic Art and the Pergamon Museum in general, as the Museum of Islamic Art and the Ancient Near East Museums, there are a lot of objects that come from the same region as we come from. And when we took the stage, let's say, and started talking about the objects that are in this museum from our own perspective, started sharing our migration story with the migration stories of these objects as well, asking questions about how did these objects come here? Is it allowed? Is it okay? Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? To talk to people in this kind of way was definitely one way to address these communities and make them feel acknowledged. The other important part as well is also that we were not museum experts. So in that way, we were also reaching out to communities in another sense. So instead of just having this white male curator who is speaking about the object, maybe if you add translation, people will understand, but there is something missing. It's not, the starting point is not equal. It's not peer-to-peer, let's say, education, or it's not peer-to-peer conversation. So once we were trained into these museums and once we became guides of these museums, it was of course way easier for these communities to come into the museum, because not only they feel addressed by the offer that we are presenting, which is of course, it's very important to mention that it was completely free of charge, completely simple offer. You just show up at the museum at 3 and you will be toured in your own mother tongue. As I said, the fact that we were not museum experts also spoke to the community in another way. So they actually felt addressed, and they felt for the first time that maybe going to a museum isn't such a European white middle class thing. Maybe even I, as a newcomer who had just arrived to Germany, I would also find a place in the museum, let's say, to talk, to discuss with a person that shares my cultural heritage as well. This is in regard to the Pergamon Museum. The other two museums, the Bode Museum and the Museum or the German Historical Museum, of course, may have objects not from the same place as we have come to, as one would imagine. However, in Bode Museum, as it is the Museum of Islamic Art, a lot of people forget that the Middle East, especially the eastern part of the Mediterranean, was also, of course, a part of the Byzantine Empire. So even talking about this, highlighting the objects that do come from Syria, for example, or from Egypt, in that museum is definitely also empowering, quote unquote. Again, the word empowering is, I find, a bit problematic. I prefer enabling, let's say. So even this aspect of it is also kind of reclaiming the agency, because people feel in a way that their cultural heritage is acknowledged, is addressed, and it's super diverse, and people should also be able to see this. Us talking about these objects was our way, let's say, to reclaim this agency and to shift the perspective of this community from being the helpless, needy asylum seeker into an active and powerful person who has a lot to say, who definitely takes their agency into their own hands. I left the German Historical Museum let's say, to the end, because this is where I give tours. And this is, as Sarah mentioned, when we were given the opportunity to choose the museums and to choose the tours or the objects that we would like to highlight in our tours, that was, of course, another way of enabling and another way of reclaiming the agency, because we are our own agents. In the German Historical Museum, we focus highly on the issues of migration, of war, of reconstruction after destruction, and we also focus on the parallels between the German and history, basically, and any other country that is going through migration movements or is going through an armed conflict, and how to rebuild the country afterwards. So this is what we are trying to do, to build this intercultural bridge, let's say. I'm gonna give the mic back to Sarah.
Yeah, I just will briefly talk about our workshops. Other than the tours, we started also conducting workshops in 2016 with a 50-50 participation. So it means that if there are, for instance, a group of participants or 10 participants in each workshop, these 10 participants should be 5 participants of the newcomers community, and the other half should be from the local community. And the idea behind this is that the workshops not only address newcomers, but also address the other part of the community in order to bring people together. And the themes of the previous workshops were, for instance, glass workshops, photo workshops, or textile workshops, and a workshop on the representation of women in both Islam and Christianity. And this is a picture of a photo workshop, and there's another slide where you can see various pictures of the workshops where they produced glass artifacts. Yeah. And we also had an exhibition held, which exhibited the products or artifacts producing during these glass workshops. So it's also a way to communicate and to engage the participants and to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, the exhibition is, of course, a part, let's say, to kind of display these artifacts. And we will also be take part in the new exhibition of the Museum of Islamic Art. Our perspectives, let's say, will be integrated within the curator's work that would basically describe any object. I just want to show like a quick picture of the team. This is the team that basically first started. We started off as 19 guides. And as you can see, there's definitely representation of both women and men, let's say, which is, of course, very important for us. And the second thing that I also wanted to say that our team is growing bigger and bigger. Right now, some of these members have left. These members, as diverse as they look, they also have entirely diverse academic backgrounds as well, which is also reaching out to different communities, because again, the museum should be a place for everybody. It should not only be a place where people who are interested in art or history, it also should be a social institute where people could come and talk based on their experience, based on their background as well. It's also very important to mention that this team basically is the Syrian and Iraqi team. Right now, or actually we are right now in the middle of also making our team bigger, and we are also including Farsi-speaking guides. So we would also reach out to other communities, such as communities who have migrated or recently migrated from Iran, from Afghanistan, and basically everybody who speaks Farsi or Dari, or Kurdish for that matter. This is a picture of the press, let's say, attention that the media attention that this project has actually gotten. It's very important to note that it was 2015, 2016. So the momentum of the refugee, quote unquote, crisis in Germany was high. However, we definitely benefit from that because since it was highly covered in the media, we were able to reach cultural institutions throughout Europe. And now we have a Multaqa international network that consists of over 25 museums who all have adapted the concept of Multaqa in their own cultural institutions. And we are active in Italy, in the UK, in many, let's say, states of the UK. And Greece is also on the way. And of course, in what did I forget? We said Italy, the UK, and in Switzerland as well. I think we don't have much time, so we were just going to say thank you very much for your attention, and we are looking forward to discussing more in the Q&A segment.
I would like to thank you all for the introduction. So thank you, Sydney, for the introduction, and I'd like to acknowledge the previous presenters. Thank you for sharing your work and your knowledge and your expertise. It's very interesting. I join you today from Cairns in Queensland, which is the state that I live in Australia. It's approximately 4 a.m. in the morning, so things are a little bit slow for me right now, but I would like to start off by providing you with a little bit of context about where I live and what is important to us with the work that I do. So it's important for us to, in Australia, or in my state, especially in Queensland, to acknowledge country. I work for the State Library of Queensland, and we are responsible for I need to acknowledge that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and our continuing connection to land, and as custodians for stories of millennia. We are inspired by this tradition to work and share and preserve Queensland's history and memory for future generations. As Sydney mentioned, my name is Louise Hunter, and I'm an Aboriginal and South Sea Islander woman. I live here in Cairns. I am from Far North Queensland. I was born here and have lived here for the majority of my life. I am a descendant of two Aboriginal grandmothers and a paternal grandfather who is of South Sea Islander descent. And I'll show you a few maps as I provide you with a little bit more context of where we actually live and where we work from. But Australia has quite a significant history in past history of colonisation that impacted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as South Sea Islander people, quite horribly, for want of a better word. And so I am a result of some of that previous colonisation that has impacted quite negatively on my people. But that being said, we are a resilient people, and I would like to acknowledge that we are working as an Indigenous person to Australia, working with my own people to assist them in various ways is quite a challenge, but also empowering and really good for me as a person and for my heart. I call that heart work. So I would like to share with you some of that context for me and how we operate. I also need to acknowledge that I have the surname that I hold is quite, connected to or linked inevitably to Indigenous people, but that my surname's actually German. My grandfather's family immigrated to Australia approximately 60 years ago. But it is important for us to acknowledge where we are from and who we are and to identify ourselves and connect with the people that we work with. So I live in Cairns, as I mentioned, on Gimoi, Wallabari, Yidinji and Irukandji lands. They are the traditional owners of the area in which I live. But I also need to acknowledge the traditional owners, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the land that across the whole state that we connect with and we work with. It is significant for us to acknowledge, create those acknowledgements and acknowledge the importance of the cultural backgrounds of the people that we work with. So I'm going to provide you with a little bit of context. The terms that I'll be using all four terms. And historically, probably in the last, say, 30 years, we've used these terms and changed these terms. As I suppose we've become more culturally appropriate as well, we've changed and utilise a variety of terms. But obviously, Aboriginal people, they're the First Nations people of Australia, the actual mainland of Australia. And the Torres Strait Islander people are the people that live between the mainland of Australia and Papua New Guinea. They are unique. I need to acknowledge that there are two unique Indigenous cultures or First Nations cultures in Australia. So the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people, and we interchange between this terminology. So we also use the term First Nations and also the term Indigenous. As I mentioned, I live in Cairns, and that is my town. Queensland is the state, and obviously Australia as a nation. But there are three levels of government that operate within Australia, and that's the federal government, the state government, the Queensland government, and also the local government. And by the local government, it's something that's pretty similar to, say, the county structures in the states within the United States. And we use the terminology Indigenous Knowledge Centres to relate to the library services that are delivered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils across our state. So I will use the term maybe Queensland government and IKCs quite regularly. And then just to give you, a little bit of context again in terms of where we actually are. As you can see that my state covers a large part of the eastern seaboard of Australia. And as I mentioned, the proximity to Papua New Guinea, to the mainland of Australia. And we work with the Torres Strait Islander community, which is that channel or that strait between Papua New Guinea and Queensland. I have to acknowledge the actual core work that we do and the partnerships that we have with local government. So as I mentioned before, there are three levels of government, and we live in a democracy, and we vote to get vote to elect those people and those three different structures. So we vote locally, we vote as a state, and we vote nationally. But the state library's core work is really around the Libraries Act, and that formalises a partnership with those councils. There are 73 councils across Queensland, and there are 16 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander shire and regional councils. So this is the formal partnership that we actually have with those councils to deliver a library service. And in the case of the Indigenous councils that we work with, those library services are referred to as Indigenous Knowledge Centres. So our role at the State Library is to facilitate funding from the Queensland Government to those local government councils. And though that degree of support, financial support, varies. It's obviously population-based, but also depends on the needs and the desires of the community or the council in which that council represents. So again, I just wanted to provide that proximity, get you back to where we actually are in the world and from a southern hemisphere perspective. But here's a map of actually our state and whom we work with. You'll see that call out is that area between the mainland of Queensland or the mainland of Australia and Papua New Guinea. That area, it refers to specifically the Torres Strait Islands. But our state is quite large. We can travel. I really need to highlight that tyranny of distance that we have to contend with. It is not uncommon for us to travel up to 5 hours and then return another 5 hours to get to where we actually need to get to. And we can travel by plane, by boat, and obviously sometimes by car. We drive to some locations depending on weather. That is a significant impact on us at certain times of the year. We live, in the tropics, so we have to contend with monsoon or rain, but also, cyclones and those kinds of things as well. So we can have severe weather events at particular times of the year. As I mentioned, it's probably worth highlighting on this slide that those blue locations are the locations where there are actually Indigenous knowledge centres in operation. The locations that are highlighted in red are locations where there is no current Indigenous knowledge centre, but we're at various stages of engaging with those councils to be able to develop one. That really is dependent upon the needs within those communities and within those councils. And we rely on those councils to approach us. We meet with them annually, sometimes maybe every second year, but we endeavour to speak with them at least once or several times a year to be able to gauge where they are at in terms of wanting to establish a library service. So this work cannot happen without actually having, staff to do that. I don't work in isolation. I have a group of staff here in Cairns. There are 5 of us in total, so 4 staff whom I lead here in Cairns. And I also have a staff member who is based in Brisbane, which is our capital city. In total, I have 4 program officers that work with those councils, so work with those IKCs and staff in those IKCs. The support that we provide to council, that financial support, means that there is currently a network of 12 councils that we work with, but also a network of 24 IKCs and a staff member in each of those locations. So for my team, they may have a relationship or work directly with 3 to 4 councils. And in some instances, one of my staff members, he works with 2 councils that operate 14 Indigenous knowledge centres. So the needs, we break that responsibility up into geographical areas, and I'll go through that a little bit more in my next slides. As I mentioned, we're a team of staff who work to support those Indigenous knowledge centres, and myself, and they're my lovely staff members there who are enjoying some sleep at this time of the morning. But they support, like I mentioned, 24 IKCs. Again, that map to really show and highlight those locations that they work with. I'll skip to the next one. So I mentioned the geographical breakdown. Again, you can see those allocations of communities and councils that they work with. Our core business is really around supporting council to operate an Indigenous Knowledge Centre, and that support can mean on-site visits, but a lot of the time it's a lot of phone, email, contact, and Zoom meetings with individuals. Zoom, we have to acknowledge that technology has assisted us in being able to do that very well. We support those libraries or those Indigenous Knowledge Centre staff to manage their local, manage their collection, so manage their books, but also manage their local collection. We also support them to deliver programs that they may be interested in, and just general service delivery, client interaction, so with their library members. We also provide professional development opportunities where we really target the needs of those Indigenous Knowledge Centre staff and really target into those needs that they may require, but also based on whatever programs we have on offer from a statewide basis. We promote the needs of councils and community to the Queensland and federal government for ongoing and continued support. And we engage with councils through their chief executive officers, and we also engage with those councils without an IKC through their CEOs also. So council is our main point of highlight. I need to highlight that councils are our main port of engagement with community and with council. So that's kind of the formal stuff out of the way. Like everyone else, I love to talk to pictures, and this is an example of being in community and our support and development that we would provide to an IKC staff member. This is a photo from Purima, so Coconut Island in the Torres Straits. Takes quite a long time to get there, about a four-hour flight and on a ferry. This is really an example of cultural practice, so weaving into the shape of a turtle. Obviously, an island community surrounded by water, and that creation of art based on environment and nature. This is the more formal side of learning and support. So within those IKCs, as you can see, that's rotation of stock there. So rotation of collections or just weeding of collections. And in some instances, really just some hands-on support to work the library management system that we support those councils to operate and utilise to manage their collection. Of course, we like to have a lot of fun, so a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun all at the same time. The collection management side of things can be, that tyranny of distance can provide a lot of blockages and issues, and here are some examples of staff just managing that collection. Again, that tyranny of distance. We did a total exchange of collections about the last 18 months to 2 years. So we've had a complete exchange of collections throughout the state and in some locations. We like to focus and provide support to communities about their local collection and provide them with relevant history titles as well. And as I mentioned previously, we provide professional development opportunities for staff. We bring them together every 2 years, and this is a workshop that we held in Cairns in March this year. Again, a local collection. We've done some support and development, some targeted support and development with staff where we've workshopped with them and identified opportunities to work with some of the missionaries and their archives, their church archives. So these are the missionaries that would have settled communities many, many years ago, decades ago. But I really want to highlight that we provide support really based on community need. My staff engage directly with the IKC staff who work quite closely with their community to identify what their local needs are. And here are just some simple examples of that. So local history, so documenting history right now, using digital devices, so digital stories, creating digital stories and digital history, provision of printed material, whether that be items generated from our own collection. And also, like I mentioned previously, digital history, so supporting just that basic engagement and use of computers and mobile devices to, remain in contact with their loved ones who may not be within community, but, on the mainland. Again, digital literacy, showing people how to use iPads and record digital stories. We have a project called PCs for IKCs, which is an opportunity that we've been granted to provide a new personal computer to each library for public use. In those locations where we haven't got an IKC, we have worked with some communities on the concept of an ideas box, which originated from Libraries Without Borders, a French organisation. So we partnered with them to adapt their ideas box or the library in a box concept that they use in refugee camps across the world. That then enabled us to work with as an intercept or to initiate the conversation with Mapoon Council about actually establishing an IKC. And in this case, we're working with them now. They've started building. This is a concept plan of a cultural centre that will also include a keeping place and a performance space for them to share culture with visitors. Our work also enables our staff, to connect with the wider services that are provided from Southeast Queensland or from Brisbane. And some of the programs that we have are First 5 Forever, which is a 0 to 5 literacy program. They're able to access professional development from the whole of the library network. We also have a languages program that's based in Brisbane that works with some of our IKCs. And our collection, we enable collections through, our website and those kinds of things, but also utilise, the work that's happening in community to also build our collection, relating to those specific communities as well. And here are just a few more, images of those projects in place. So First 5 Forever. Our languages programs, and we use bilingual signage within the IKCs by working with those staff. And as I mentioned, Queensland Memory, so making the collections that we have in Brisbane accessible within community. This is an image of some ladies seeing some historical photos from their community. And this is an example of collections that we've created and brought online so that people can access through social media or through our website. Just wanted to highlight our social media. We do a lot of work on social media promoting the services that we provide in our work, but also our collections as well. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I'm happy to hang around and answer some questions.
Good afternoon, and thank you for those really amazing presentations by all of our speakers. I learned a ton. And before I begin, again, I'm Kemi Alesami. I am coming to you from Lenape land, which is now often known as Brooklyn, in New York City. And acknowledgement was something that really ran through so many of the presentations, which I deeply appreciated. And I would like to thank the Met for bringing us all together and curating this incredible diversity of knowledges. So just as an audience, we've had about an hour of presentations, and I took a lot of notes, and I just had words that I kind of picked out that I just wanted to replant for us before going into Q&A. And just to warn the speakers, a lot of new questions came up just from listening to you guys, because I sent you guys, of course, questions ahead of time. And we'll see what the balance of old versus new. And for those of you in the audience, the Met is collecting questions, and towards the end, I will definitely try to open up about 10 minutes or so of questions so we can hear what you would like to know more about. But some of the things that just stood out to me, knowledge creators, social issues, mobile, organizing, silence, dancing with objects, opening the museum, inside out and letting go, community visits, social cohesion, meeting point, multiple stories, newcomers, feeling addressed, not experts, agency, custodians of the stories of millennia, heart work, where are we on the map, the tyranny of distance, cultures of practice, local, community, all of those words came up many times, but I want to end on an acronym that I'm going to hold on to from now on, because how amazing would it be if we all had IKCs in our own communities? So those are just some of the many, many paths we can travel in just everything you have offered. I already feel incredibly nourished. So thank you so much. And one of the things that you all touched on, sometimes more directly than others, was language, right? And just thinking about language, talking about language, the importance of naming and who names and the directions in which language travels. And Salma, as you were speaking, you talked a number of times about words that you struggled with and that you felt needed to be challenged. So I'm going to start with you because you're easy and you already are thinking about this. But what I want to say is that I want each of you to actually think about a word that you think needs to be challenged in the way that you work, a word that comes up in your space that you want to challenge, or a word that you'd like to insert and lift up and amplify. And Salma, you had lots of choices. There was empower, there was migrant, those are two that just stood out, migrant, movement, migration. But is there a word that you really want to pull up as like empower, that you really want to challenge how we use that? Or something that you want to lift up that we should use more often?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question. I think the word that I, both on the project level and on the personal level as well, that I have struggled with the most since I arrived in Germany in 2014 was the word integration. And I really can't stress that enough, because I mean, after hearing the word integration, it just turns into this like checklist of attributes that we, again, the newcomers or the outsiders, that it's a list of, let's say, attributes that you have to kind of obtain in order to be tolerated, let's say, by a new community that you are living in. And I think this is not a welcoming way, and this is definitely not an inclusive way to go about anything that you would like to go about. So I would say that the word integration, and to be honest, even the word Syrian has been problematic at certain times, because it's not the word as such, it's the context of the word, for example. I remember like Sarah and I were trying to identify, we were like doing sessions at the German Historical Museum, and we wanted to kind of distinguish our author from the author of the museum, let's say, residence. And I spent like around 20 minutes thinking about whether or not I should introduce myself as a Syrian or not. Not because I do not identify as a Syrian, just because I thought that when I say the word Syrian, first of all, I'm going to be othered by a certain community. Another community might think that I'm using this as a card. Yet another community might also think that I'm reduced to only being a Syrian, or that this is everything that I have to offer. So I think it really highly depends on the context. And this was also like my answer to the second part of your question, that there isn't necessarily one word that I would like to highlight or use. What I would like basically is to reach a point where the words that I'm using do not have so many connotations of inclusion and exclusion. But of course, this is like me thinking utopically and living in my own utopia and in my own brain. But I would just like to say this, that there isn't, of course, there are words that we should definitely not use, which is refugee and integration. And this is basically a recipe for disaster. And it's important to note, I'm talking about the context of Germany. So just to make stuff very clear, basically Europe. But words that should be highlighted is basically up to the community that we are trying to address. Because if we don't address people in the way that they would like to be addressed, then we are not addressing them.
Thank you.
We are addressing ourselves. Thank you.
Samir, I would love to hear what you might lift up. And just to note, yours is the only museum, I believe, today that uses the word community in its name, right? And I loved hearing that history of the Anacostia Museum, which is a museum I visit because I'm actually from Prince George's County in Maryland and was just there a month ago. It is a museum that I know. But what is a word when you think about this work that you either want to expunge, challenge, or lift up?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kemi. And I'm really glad to hear that you've been to the museum. I think I'm not deeply tied to words and this notion of expunging or holding one up, but I think an idea maybe that I consider to be at the heart of at least my practice is co-creation. This idea of working meaningfully and deeply with communities, it's just so central to me, to this idea of doing community-based work, right? That yes, the institution is held up as the host of a particular exhibition or program, but the fact that it's a deeply co-created and the product of meaningful collaboration for me is just so crucial to, I think, ensuring that the work that our institutions do or that our museums do is truly serving the community.
Thank you. And Josh, I'm going to go to you. I'm holding on to dance, which I may not.
I agree with what's been said so far. I mean, for me, a problematic, but then sometimes unproblematic word, but I think when the museum uses it's problematic is ownership, right? This idea that the National Museum of Natural History owns these things. What does that mean? And so I think too often, too often that ends up cutting the relations that these things, ancestors to spirits to just plain objects, have to the worlds that they came from. And so the flip side of that, of course, is ownership, original ownership, or where that emerged from is actually, that's what I would love to see. So for me, it's being in a museum that realizes, or within an institution, we're getting there, that realizes that the museum is a kind of a way station as opposed to an endpoint. That this is, to echo what Samir has been talking about, this is about co-creation, which means letting go, right? And sometimes you dance with someone and sometimes you don't, and you're doing a solo and you need to let them dance with other people. And so I think museums need to think very hard about why they're holding on to things, why they're claiming ownership of stuff, which is either explicitly not theirs or implicitly for various reasons.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would really like to stress another word, which is at the same time, I would say, a strategy, and that's the strategy of sharing authority, which came in my mind. And well, it has to do with our project and also with myself. On the one hand, one can say that shifting or sharing authority is a shift not only to two-way communication, but sharing of authority. And so saying we are not just talking about you, but you are part of the story, and you should be telling the story as well. So I think this is something I really want to push forward. And in this way, the museum is, is beginning to tell the stories of previously unvoiced populations or communities. And of course, this has also something to do with myself, because for me, as a white-skinned academic, woman, or who holds the German citizenship, I'm privileged. So I also, within my work, I'm constantly asking myself, what is my authority, and how can we share these authorities? Yeah, that's something I think which is very important for me.
Thank you. And we'll end with Lou on this.
I think the two words for me are relationship and partnership. For me, the partnership is that the formalization of that work with a community or with a council. And that partnership cannot be maintained or become better and progressed address issues without having a great relationship and communication with those councils and with those people, the IKC coordinators working in their libraries. So they're two really important words for me that are used quite loosely within our structures, but also, just highlighting that there's a difference there. And we really want to, we really want to have great relationships with the staff at all levels within an IKC and within a council. We rely quite heavily then on them working and knowing their community needs and what their community issues are, and working with them to address those, to provide access and that support and that service that they require.
Thank you. And that was just a question that just came from listening to each of you and recognizing that language is something we just struggle with so much. I really appreciate that, and pulling up some of these ideas. And in thinking about issues of community partnership and community relationships, power is central. And being able to think about issues of power. So when Josh, you talk about ownership, and Sarah, you talk about authority, I want to spend a little time there thinking about how do you, in your work, break down power? And I'm actually going to connect this to the idea of care, because many of you are engaged in curation of various forms. Samir is in your title. And that's coming from the Latin word to care. And how do we show up in a way that feels genuinely caring? And that's, again, something I sort of feel like is running through the work, a lot of what you guys have discussed. So I'll throw this at a couple of people and then we'll kind of mix it up. But Samir, I'll start with you. How do you and the museum challenge notions of power and authority? How does that show up in the work, and how do you navigate that with community members and visitors?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for it. I would say that process is at the heart of these kinds of building of relationships. We don't have a specific goal or end in sight per se. It's really about an ever-evolving relationship with our communities, and even community itself. That notion of community is not static, right? So how we've tried to give meaning to that term community, and what community or communities we represent and work with has changed over time. And so I think as much as we can, we center process and this notion of really trying to listen in a sense at the feet of the community, to ensure that we're guided as much as possible by their needs, interests, and desires. And whether that be in the realm of exhibitions or programming, or helping inform collections work. So, in short, I think process, not having a static fixed notion of what is and what should be, but being in communication with, in conversation with, continually with community. That process itself hopefully is generative, and as a guiding kind of principle for how we want to bring into being some notion of community through our work.
Thank you. Salma, someone who's coming into this space from a different space, what feels, what helps to break that system of power for you when you are interacting with an institution?
Well, I have to be very honest here. It's very challenging, actually, to try even to break out this institutional power, let's say. First of all, I really have to acknowledge this. I really can't stress this high enough. I think that we are, especially, again, I'm just speaking mainly about the German context. Of course, the museums in the US or in Australia have different structures, but the museum that we are working with, or the museums that we are working with, are highly, highly, highly bureaucratic institutions. And we are a part of the State Museums of Berlin, which means that challenging the power of our direct boss is doable. However, challenging the power of the person above that is, of course, it's completely challenging. It really is challenging if you want to change the structure. What we try to do is basically to even kind of like to talk about these issues, to shed light on that, to talk about this with our, let's say, colleagues, as well as with our, let's say, target groups or with the communities that we are working with. But I have to say, this is one of the shortcomings of this project, that we have not been yet able to challenge the structural power imbalance that exists within these museum structures. And again, I'm just being completely honest here. Probably they're not going to appreciate me saying this on recorded Zoom, but again, I just think that challenging the power structure as such in this bureaucratic institutional sense is something that we haven't yet achieved. However, what we can say is that, I don't think that we've mentioned this in the presentation, for example, that the perspectives of the Multaqa guides within the Museum of Islamic Art will be included in the 2026 permanent exhibition. So that might be just one step ahead to kind of make sure that these perspectives are there on the side or exactly close to the perspective of a white male curator or a white female German curator or. So in my opinion, that might not be challenging for the structure as such, but it definitely challenges the narrative of this institution. And I think that might be the way, or let's say one way to kind of maneuver this issue.
Thank you. And Sarah, now I don't know which of you said this, but it's in my notes, this idea of breaking the truth and breaking hierarchy, which is of course what a little bit of what Salma is pulling up from your space in this institution and your particular self. How do you go about trying to break truth and to challenge hierarchies that have, in many cases, caused a lot of harm and certainly caused a lot of challenge for different communities who might be trying to engage with your institution?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, actually, Salma mentioned the bureaucratic jungle, and this is, of course, hardly understandable, and I'm not going to talk about this, but well, I think the hierarchies and the language are two aspects which we try to, not to overcome, but to deal with. And I think an approach is to, as we already mentioned, to intertwine or to implement various or multiple stories, and also to see that the museum should and could introduce formats which allows people to, let's say, to independent of their background, to participate and to gain authority. So I think this is something which I would stress, that it's a question of authority to share it and to take part.
Thank you. Josh, I'm going to go to you because, of course, you mentioned repatriation and an actual repatriation initiative that you've been part of. And that's such a conversation animating our field. And I say that as a woman who is Nigerian and American, but the Benin bronzes are very much on my mind many days of the week, right? Just as an example. So, and you talked about letting go and the importance of institutions to let go. And that really struck me. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what is the gift waiting on the other side of letting go, because people are not trying to do it, so, or not often enough. So what is that? What's the path towards it? And what's the nirvana or something that waits on the other side if institutions can figure out how to practice letting go?
Yeah, well, I want to just acknowledge that I think that's a process, right? And, Samir captured a lot of that. This is a process of listening, consultation, and probably most importantly, failure and willingness to fail. I think a lot of institutions get so caught up with, and I'm speaking really in my experience in natural history, with, oh my gosh, are we going to do the right thing? Is this statement going to be perfect? And I would advocate that actually institutions, and obviously institutions aren't monolithic like communities, they're made up of individual actors, all who have different sets of agendas and kind of desires and motivations. But I think that willingness to kind of lean into the issues is what I would argue. And, that particular moment where the remains were returned, it was fascinating. I mean, that was something that emerged because Te Papa Aotearoa, New Zealand's National Museum, approached us as part of their national or international searching for materials. It was very straightforward and something that actually we welcomed, which was wonderful and very humbling to be a part of. And I think, it was, these things kind of just open doors, right? They show goodwill. They just allow, there's the metaphor that often gets bandied about the Smithsonian is that we're the nation's attic, which is this horrible metaphor, right? This is where you put stuff and forget about it, or you hide stuff. And I'm always like, no, we're not that. And I think engaging in these dialogues, engaging in this sort of listening and the work that Samir and others are doing, that we're trying to do through Recovering Voices, is about transforming that. It's not, the Smithsonian is not the nation's attic. We're actually the meeting ground. We're the kind of space where people need to come and talk. And so Secretary Bunch kind of personifies that through what he's been able to do at Namak. And through his leadership, I really see this new opportunity, right? Like right now, we're dealing with the remains, remains of formerly enslaved African Americans, right? And a lot of museums are dealing with that. And Secretary Bunch has been fantastic in that regard, as is other of my colleagues kind of leaning into this difficult issues. And I think the more museums kind of step out of that, we are here as scholars or scholarly institutions, right? The Smithsonian's credo is the increase in diffusive knowledge. But I think that knowledge can only come about through engagement, right? Through that deep sort of collaborative work that we're talking about. So it's just that willingness and being open and letting go is just important. Objects they're not solid, right? They're momentary effervescence of like amazing sets of activity, artistic achievements that are here, and museums kind of help them last a long time. But sometimes some objects don't need to last that long, or they don't need to be in that one institution. And like the Benin bronzes, I could go on, but yeah, it's about letting go and just being open to it.
Thank you so much. Lou, I love so much the way that, again, you kind of placed us on a map. You showed us where you were, you named who your ancestors were and how you came to be in the body and person that you are, and such a beautiful reminder for me. I really, really deeply appreciated that. And one of the things I love about this panel is that we have so many different institutional cultures represented, different communities around the world, and again, all these different approaches, but this real commitment to relationships and to people. And one of the things you also did, Lou, that I really appreciated was naming staff and structure, the things that allow us to do the work. And how has some of that, the how of the work, how has that shifted or changed over time in relationship to doing the work? What did you learn by being in connection and starting up and activating IKCs, that what might be something that moved or shifted because you heard back from community that something needed to shift?
We have, give you a little bit more context, we've been working with councils, specifically those Indigenous councils, for the past 20 to 25 years. Next year, the very first IKC will celebrate 20 years of being open in community. So that's something we will try to celebrate in some way, and figuring out how we can do that. Those conversations are being had. So I have worked in this position for 7 years, so I don't know all of the history intimately, but the important thing is that openness, as Joshua's mentioned, and, those conversations. But from our point of view, we have to listen, and we have to digest that information, and we have to figure out collectively and collaboratively how we, make those changes, and how we allow or provide that information. In the end, kind of what Josh has mentioned is it's not about, we don't own this information, we don't own this history. And so we have to provide that opportunity for communities to be able to access, and whatever that means by physically coming in and traveling, up to 5 hours to get there. That is an expensive process. So our challenge is about getting that information out to the community, and really just support them, listen to them in terms of what their needs are, and trying to make that happen. From a point of view of managing staff who actually do that work, I found it quite difficult starting off. I'm the type of person that wants to understand and learn in community. I don't want them to have to come to us all of the time and have to tell us what they're chasing. And that kind of, just comes down to me as a person and as an individual, and, me culturally and who I am and how I choose to go about doing that work. It is hard to be an Aboriginal person, not being Torres Strait Islander, but also and having that cultural knowledge, but at the same time trying to understand and work within that framework that is created by the bureaucracy. And so that understanding that intimately, because it impacts on me and my people personally as well, my families, my communities. So I take really ownership in that, and being able to create that change. And that's where, when we do, really sometimes celebrating just those really small achievements and feeling great about that to help people, to help my people. Sometimes it's quite, Salama kind of covered this in terms of her response as well, where it is difficult being an Indigenous person, a First Nations person of this country, working with our own mob, working with my own people, because you don't have that opportunity of switching off at 5 o'clock in the evening and, going back home. It is not uncommon for me to be contacted on social media or on my phone, asking me questions about certain things that have been put on, have been sent out or gone out to the press or something, information that's been released, collections that have been released. It's not uncommon to be stopped while I'm shopping and doing my groceries and asked questions. And so that kind of identity for me, it doesn't stop at 5 o'clock, and I continue to, help people and answer questions, because I know if the roles were reversed, I would want those answers as well. So it is difficult to manage that power and to manage and, talk utilize a language. So I speak an English language, but acknowledge that, there are traditional languages still being spoken in Australia, and that can be an issue. But, really breaking down that bureaucratic lingo language that we call, that's, breaking that down and really then providing that opportunity to listen, to communicate and listen and hear back and create that change.
Thank you. And so much wisdom from all of you. Deeply appreciate it. And I'm now going to start turning to a few of the questions that are showing up in the chat to give our many audience members a chance to ask their questions. So I'm going to maybe start with this one for you, Samir. And Valerie is asking, how much of Anacastia's museum exhibitions and programming is generated directly by the community? Are those programs and exhibitions developed through the filter of the museum professional alone or directly by the community? A little bit of what that balance looks like, and is appreciating that it seems like you guys are set up to do that more readily than some.
Yes, I would say that has changed over time, just in terms of the museum's approach to that question. And early on in the museum's life, there was a community advisory board that served in that capacity. And that's shifted over time. And in the most recent incarnation since I've been there, it's not been institutionalized in that way. It's been much more informal. So whether it's in the case of exhibitions where we have advisory working groups that can provide ideas and content and resources and leads, or in terms of programming where it's someone reaching out saying, hey, I have local organizations, we do this kind of work. Would you be open to hosting a program for us or by us? Or providing pathways for local artists to be able to do workshops. And so I think now it's not institutionalized or formalized in a way. It's much more informal. I think as a community accountable institution, people know that they can come to us and offer suggestions and ideas and work with us in that way. So that's the most recent incarnation of how we approach the work, not in as formalized a way as it once was, but we're always continually exploring, what might work best.
Just as a quick follow-up, when did the community council get phased out? Because that was part of your presentation that definitely caught my eye. Yeah,
so I don't know the exact year when it was phased out. We still have a community advisory board or an advisory board. And for various projects, we have these advisory working groups that serve a similar purpose. But it's true that we don't have, as we once did, a youth advisory council. We have had in recent years kind of moments where we had that, but at the moment we don't.
Thank you. Here's a question that is not addressed to anyone in particular, but I will see if anyone volunteers or pick someone. This from Christine. How do it jumped. Okay. How do each of your programs approach the idea of cultural competence? Do you conduct any kind of cultural competency training with your staff and or community members? Lou, I see you nodding, which I might take as a volunteer.
It definitely is not a easy topic to cover. We're defined by our statewide structures, so we do have programs that all staff have to undertake, even myself. That training, nationally, there's a project that our National State and Libraries Association is undertaking so that there is some consistency in that cultural knowledge, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, First Nations, Indigenous knowledge, so that there's, you know, that groundwork or that base structure or base knowledge that everybody has. And then we'll continue to build on that. I don't think that it will, you know, undertaking that base knowledge or that base program will not answer every question and it will not address every issue. Because as we evolve as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, as we evolve as a state, a community, a state and a nation, that, you know, that need those specific topics that may need to be covered will change. We're quite a young country. There is, you know, historically we had no treaty, like say in the case of New Zealand, we didn't have a treaty with the English colonizers. So we need to grow more as a nation. There's lots of different work that is being undertaken across the various states in terms of treaties and a national voice to Parliament. So, you know, that's more of that political stuff, but that does what is happening broadly in society impacts upon what we do work-wise and how we have to undertake that. So I'm sorry, I'm not, you know, particularly answering that, you know, specifically, because, you know, we're still, it's a challenge for all Australians. It's a challenge for all government agencies to have to do that, as well as, you know, when you think of our population is quite diverse. We have a lot of refugees coming into Australia. So, you know, understanding their needs as well. I just specifically work in that Aboriginal, in that Indigenous space. And then also that's different for, you know, my staff. I also have some non-Indigenous staff that work in my team. We're not all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander staff. So, you know, they have different learning needs and perspectives as well, and have to be really guided by having that strong relationship with the people that they work with to ensure that they're not being offensive or they're, you know, doing the wrong thing. They're not going to, you know, they're going to the appropriate places within communities that they're able to go with. So there are multiple levels and there's no one answer.
Great, thank you. Josh, I'm going to direct this question at you. It's about collecting oral histories, which came up in your presentation. Collecting the oral histories of Indigenous populations is challenging, but extremely vital for future generations. How have you overcome and navigated some of those challenges, and what has been challenging, I guess?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to answer that is maybe use examples from my own fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. And so certainly I have had the pleasure and honor of working in the Prairie Delta of Papua New Guinea on the South Coast. And there, you know, communities have actually been engaged with anthropologists on and off for about 100 years before I came. And so people are aware of anthropologists. But they were also very aware that there have been a few books written about the area, but they kind of, a lot of the elders saw me as a chance to kind of document their history. And I kind of presented it that way, but I said, look, I'm interested in your history, thinking about like life history. And I had this wonderful experience with this, you know, man, Elder Koivu was sitting down with me and telling me this story, and he's starting this, what, you know, maybe Euro-Americans would think of myth. And he was doing ancestral stories. And I kind of interrupted him, which of course is what you're not supposed to do. And I said, no, I'm kind of interested in your youth. And he was like, son, you know, effectively told me to sit down. And he was like, you know, to get where we are, we have to start in the mountains and then travel down the river. And we have to come to where we are in the present, right? This kind of space-time movement. And so that kind of was education. So it gets to another thing about humility of learning what oral history and what a life history is for people. And then also it's about building trust. I had a lot of people who thought what I was doing was stealing secrets, which, you know, given the politics of knowledge in Papua New Guinea and just academia in general, are totally valid. I think I proved them wrong, hopefully, by bringing back copies of everything I recorded in terms of transcripts for the knowledge holders. And so then that opened up like, hey, well, when are you going to talk to me? And why are you only talking to the old people? I think the big challenge now has been that now that elders have passed, elders who expressly really wanted their story documented. Now their children are saying, you know, my dad told you some things I'd rather you not share. And so then that push and pull of the politics of knowledge. But I think it's a collaborative process. It's something that one has to be very open about. There are some things that academics can learn about, but we shouldn't be publishing, right? And then that then raises the question of where do they go? I do believe in the utility of museums and archives for being one set of repositories for communities, right? So one hopes that in the future, stuff that I collected will be easily accessible. And then hopefully some hierarchy of who gets access to it will be developed with the community, but it's a complicated issue.
Absolutely. And so many possibilities for what else we could talk about. This has been incredible and fascinating, and I feel like I learned a ton, and I hope that the audience has as well. Believe it or not, it is 3 o'clock. So thank you so much. Go to sleep, Lou. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all. Thank you to the